Welcome to FAS's International Conference on Agrarian Change. Please note that first this session you are about to attend will run from 2:15 p.m. to 4 p.m. On behalf of the organizing committee, I'm pleased to invite the chair, Jayan Jose Thomas.
Good afternoon to you all, friends. I think we should begin very soon. I will not take any time. We have 4 presentations today. Well-known scholars, all of the first 2 presentations are going to be on food security in India. Brinda and Surabhi will be presenting the first paper, followed by Sudha Narayanan will be presenting the second paper. The third paper will be on housing conditions in rural India, and the fourth paper that will be done by Shamsher, and the fourth paper, Professor Nagaraj will be speaking about agricultural subsidies. We'll hear from him. So, please, Brinda, first. We'll have 15 to 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's what I'll try. Yeah, 15 minutes I'll try. Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jayan, and thank you, FAS. This is going back to the NSSO consumption data, looking at nutrients in terms of calories and proteins that has come out in the recent time. So my co-author Surabhi is my PhD student. She was beginning to look at the millets consumption, and that's when Dr. Ram and Dr. Madhura approached for this conference, and I said, probably it's time to go back to this old work, which I had been doing earlier with my co-author J.V. Meenakshi from Delhi School. So this is basically to say that there are 2 NSS rounds which came close by next to each other, 22-23 and 23-24. Some methodological changes are there, and we are still exploring how it would impact nutrient intakes, but doesn't look like it's affecting nutrition as such so much. Our focus is largely on calories, proteins, and fats, which are called as macronutrients, and because it was more easy to organize the data for that part. And the focus is also on micronutrients, partly through Surabhi's thesis, where she's looking at the role of millets and how does it really have an impact, and whether the cost of nutrients is comes down because of that particular aspect of using millets. So we have focused a little bit, I've taken a little bit from our thesis, and then I'm comparing rural and urban intakes and how much does it change within a span of 1 year. So the data is basically average per capita intakes per day per consumer unit values. These are the 2 commonly used measures. And for the methodology in terms of getting into the deprivation rates, I'll be focusing more on the head count ratio for lack of time, and which is basically the FGT0 measure. And then we are looking at in between, and also show if we vary the norms, what happens, because that's again a very major debate in this particular literature surrounding calories. And then lastly, I'll be very quickly rushing through the results that comes from what happens when free rice and wheat was given, how does it displace millet consumption and hence micronutrients. So here we are using an impact evaluation method, but I wouldn't go into too much of detail there. So we have the household level unit record data that is being used, and quantities of food items are being converted into the nutrient intakes. So most of the NSSO reports have themselves given the conversion factors. That's what we have used. And for micronutrients, we went back to the Gopalan ICMR earlier values to convert them into the micronutrients. And because millets are more prone towards calcium, iron, and zinc, so these are the 3 micronutrients that we are focusing on. So basic, as I said, per capita intake, per consumer unit, we all know that households have different compositions and gender compositions. Once again, NSSO gives certain numbers on how to convert the household size, which is say 4 can become 3.2 depending on whether there are smaller children. So I've used that methodology only to convert, keeping it with the official methods. There could be other methods to do it. As far as this time what happened is NSSO did not collect millet data from all the states, and it also didn't provide millet disaggregates for all the states. So we had to only focus on millets for these states, which are predominantly millet consuming states. But among these also Odisha got left out, and so on. I'll come to that. And in this particular part of the study, we are only focusing on the rural areas, because there's also possibility of homegrown consumption for and how does it affect nutrient intake. So very quickly, this is what is happening between the 2 years in terms of the NSS data. So here you can see it's per capita, per day caloric intake. The distribution doesn't look very different, but there are certain patterns which are slightly different between per capita and per consumer unit. I haven't yet figured out. You see a word adjusted here. I mean, I've added this. This is basically, NSS again has given this time a method to adjust for meals given and meals taken. We have just used that formula to adjust for the consumption that households tend to take meals from outside, and they also tend to give, and that's the adjustment. You can see that this red line out here, the red is for 22-23, the black is for 23-24. So there is a slight inward shift in the consumption at the lowest level. That's the point that you're seeing here. And that's also happening a little more, but not that obvious. So as a result, there's a higher density in the middle part that we are talking about. Now, how does this affect the deprivation rates is what I'm going to show here. So I've used different norms because there's again a lot of controversy or a lot of debate on what norm to use. So I'm using the numbers that are coming from 2400, which is the ICMR norm for rural areas. And there's an 1800 norm that comes from the FAO. So comparing these two, you can see that there's a dramatic increase between the ICMR norm and the 1800 kilocalorie norm from 25 to 70. But we can also see that there is a slightly increase in this particular value here. And that's largely, that from what I understand is coming because at the upper end also there is a decline in caloric intake, which is kind of adding towards this number here. And interestingly, between rural and urban areas, if you use the same norm, you can see that urban areas are showing a slightly higher number, both in the 1800. But if you look at the 2400 calories, about 50% of the urban people, so I'm looking at persons, so these are the number of persons, 49% are calorie deprived as per this norm, and then 46%. So that's again a very huge number that we have already, that we are familiar with in this Indian context. So those numbers remain still very high, even with the latest round of NSS data. So this is just a summary here. If I go to the per consumer unit norm, which is coming from the Nagaraj committee report for the poverty intakes, you can see that rural headcount ratio has actually declined from 32 to 28, so if you use this norm, and in the urban it has declined from 33 to 28 during this period. So again, we see that there is that debate of what norm to use, based on which norm you're trying to see the decline, extent of decline, all of that continues even with these rounds, and we are not yet able to resolve those patterns that we have seen earlier. With proteins, again, the norms are not very clear. Again, these two norms of 48 grams for rural areas and 55 grams for urban areas is given in the Nagaraj committee report. So I've used that. And sorry, 48 and 50 are what it is used. And it was more an experiment to understand this 55 grams. And you can clearly see that when you just jump from 48 to 55, just a 5 foot, 7 or 8 grams, or when you go from 50 to 55, there's a huge increase in the deprivation rates in terms of head count ratios. So I've not shown it here, but you can see it in the paper. The curve is very steep. The probability density function is very steep around this point. So you can see a 5 gram increase suddenly increases almost doubles it and the deprivation rates. So that is kind of important for us to notice. And that also happens in the urban areas if you see 26 to 40, but not to the same extent. And here you can see that the deprivation rates for proteins is lower in urban areas than in rural areas compared to the calories. So I think I've summarized this. Then we come to the fats, which is where I think the entire changes have happened quite a lot. First and the foremost, these are the norms. These two are the norms that we are giving here for fat, again from the Nagaraj committee report. This 42 grams was given in another report much earlier, so I've used that also. And again, you can see that between 26 and 42, we are actually doubling the fat norms, but then we can see that the rates are accordingly changing here. But once again, you can see that the deprivation rates are far lower with fat intakes compared to the others. And this is what is kind of the major change that we are sort of concerned about. And you can see that the rates are actually within a year, which is also interesting to note that within a year, there's been a much larger decline in fat intakes compared to any other. So calories have actually shown a different pattern. So again, so it kind of adds more to the puzzle that we have already been looking at in this particular data set and try to understand here. Then I come to the new, part of millets, which are now being referred to as nutri-cereals by Niti Aayog and others. So the focus of the data set that's available in NSS is jowar, bajra, maize, ragi, barley and small millets. The kind of the millets that are varying across different states. So as a result, the micronutrient content also varies for different micronutrients, and the deprivations are different, but the norms are more difficult, and we're still working a little bit more because we have not yet expanded to the other food commodities. We have to do that in the context of the millets, and the work is still in progress. So one of the things is that the two traditional states of Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, they've missed out in giving disaggregate values. They have not collected the disaggregate values on millets. They've only given a composite this thing on millets, so we had to exclude them. And Orissa, which has a millet mission, there is no data on Odisha also in this particular case. So those are the points that we observe. So here if you see that the change in, so here we compare also with 2011-12. So the millets intake, the per capita per month intake comes from 3 kgs to 2 kgs to 1.8. So that's the decline that we are seeing here. So this 10-year decline, this is an annual decline that I'm talking about in the last 10 years. So that's where you're trying to see the change. The rice intake has declined between 11-12 and 22-23, and the wheat intake actually also declines, but not at all to the same extent that rice has declined. So there is that particular aspect that by in the COVID years, free grains and free rice and wheat was being given. No free millets is being given in any of the states, or at least the data is not showing that. But we see that despite that, 22-23, where there is a lot of access, supposedly access to free grains, we can see that still the rice intake is not very high. And this is what is one of the things that, what is it doing? How are people trying to sort of expand their diets is something that we are still work in progress. So what we see is that during this period, because of the free grains, one of the things that we see is that the market share of rice and wheat has come down. Most of it is taken by the free grains, a little bit by PDS. But what we also observe is that all in the variation across these states in terms of access to PDS and free grains is also very different. Some states have a lot more free grain access, lot more households reporting free grains, some households predominantly still reporting PDS but very less of free grains, and some reporting 50-50 of PDS and free grains. So there's also a lot of variation across states on how this is getting implemented, but there are hardly any states that are giving any nutri-cereals in terms of the free grains policy that they mentioned there. So here is where we just a quick look at the evaluation, the impact evaluation. So this is a propensity score matching where we were able to sort of distinguish the households. So interestingly, we came across a set of households who have access to the Pradhan Mantri Anna Yojana program. That means they show that they have a card, but they are not consuming any free grains. And there is another set of households who do consume. So we kind of use a propensity score matching and then try to look at the average intakes. And you can see that the decline in the share of the micronutrients from the nutri-cereals, that is, it's evident in certain states, but not in all the states that we are looking at it, but there are certain states, and this is largely because what kind of millets that they are consuming. So if it's ragi, because iron is content is very high, we see a little bit more in Karnataka. So there is also that diversity that we see in terms of this. So the source of calories, sort of micronutrients is getting affected. And we want to know whether this also changes the price per, which is a work in future. So, so what we are basically seeing is that the national level averages are not the right thing to look at. We have to look at the state level variations. The state level variations, and there's a lot of heterogeneity. The decline in average intake varies, and share of micronutrients from nutri-cereals has declined only in a couple of states. So they're still able to maintain, and that how are they able to do that is something that we are still studying and working on. So in conclusion, focusing on rural India and based on per consumer unit per day as a metric. So we prefer per consumer unit because we're trying to compare quintile 1 to Q1 to Q5 or lowest. The household sizes change a lot, so that can also affect the per capita intake. So that's where we feel that it's better to look at per consumer unit. So it has decreased marginally between 22-23 and 23-24, and protein intakes are stable, whereas fat intakes have gone up within that one year period. The per consumer unit intake. The calories and protein intakes have declined since 2011, while fat intakes have gone up. And the inequality between rich and poor and between rural and urban is still very stark. So we look at the quantiles and fractile wise data, that's still very high in terms of the rich and the poor, and also the rural and urban. So the expenditure share on pulses and products and vegetables and fruits have declined. So this is these are the two studies which have done with this recent one, and they clearly find that the processed food and beverages and everything has gone up. So that's probably showing up on the fats compared to the other commodities. So that also we need to understand what's the role of price and what is the role of accessibility and so on. So our work is still in progress in terms of the detailed analysis of micronutrient intakes and also macronutrients from the sources, like what happens when you look at free PDS homegrown, and most importantly trying to understand what is the way in which the price per nutrient is changing because of the presence of these policies, and then how does it allow people to diversify either within the food group or even beyond the food group is what is the next thing that we are planning to look at. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about food subsidies, focusing mainly on the public distribution system. And within that, my focus is at a very macro level, all India level, and just on rice and wheat. So I'm going to neglect the fact that many states have a rich basket of commodities. I'm going to neglect the fact that different states have different types of systems in terms of entitlements. So for those of you who may not know, it's a network of fair price shops that sell rations. It has been there from the pre-war era, and it was targeted in 1997 to focus on eligible groups, and Madhura Swaminathan has in fact written a lot about that. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is that I'm going to talk about a lot of other scholars who have worked on this, but I've not necessarily put all their names here, so that's a caveat. But this whole issue of the PDS sort of came back into the public imagination in the 2000s due to a case that's famously called the Right to Food case, but more in the legal thing, it is the People's Union of Civil Liberties versus the Government of India. So at that time, there was starvation in Rajasthan, and just a few kilometers away, there was an FCI godown that was just overflowing with grain. So PUCL put a case against the Government of India saying that these should be distributed. And the Government of India essentially said, but we already do it. And they fell into the trap of the judge then asking, if you're doing that, why is there famine? Now make all of these entitlements. So that was the way it went, and it came from the constitutional right to life. So there was no right to food, but that's the story. And so what happened was that because of the Supreme Court ruling, very quickly they became legal entitlements. They weren't until then. And that eventually led to the National Food Security Act. I think Brinda has already talked a little bit about NFSA, post-NFSA, the COVID crisis and how the grains are now free. But the right side sort of shows you what the NFSA offered. Basically, the PDS is not the only thing the Right Food Security Act does. It has a life cycle approach starting from ICDS for children to midday meals to PDS. So this is the context. But within that, they built in some flexibility for states to experiment with cash transfers. And I'm mentioning that here because of what I'm going to talk about. So this is the background. For those of you who don't know, this distribution of grain, the grain comes from where? It's not imports. It's a huge procurement system which is set up to procure grains from the farmer at what is called the minimum support price. You could think of it as a price of acquisition of those grains. And the FCI or the state agencies procure it. Then state agencies that distribute it take it at something called the central issue price. And then it's distributed to beneficiaries. And in the old system, it was bifurcated into TPDS, targeted and untargeted, but now that distinction is gone. There are also other welfare schemes. So it goes into different schemes, including the midday meals. So this is the background. But now I have to rush because I have lots to say. So this PDS has been the bone of contention. And these are the 5 things that I'm going to talk about today. The first is that the costs are too high. And therefore, the too high meaning that the cost of transferring a rupee's worth benefits is greater than 1. And then there is this other narrative that says the procurement system for getting grains is deeply flawed. It's focused on large farmers. It's restricted to specific geographies. And it procures it at distortionary prices and promotes monoculture or the cropping pattern is then skewed in favor of just rice and wheat. From the consumption side, there is a criticism that it undermines dietary diversity and crowds out nutritious foods. Then there's another group that says this is creating problems for India and the WTO. And this whole debate then leads to this view that the PDS should be replaced with cash transfers. And it's been subsumed by this whole call for evidence-based policy, which is a code word for do many RCTs to show what we need to show or want to show. Yes, the food subsidies are high, 220 billion. You can see how it's risen in recent years. The spike that you see in the middle is actually just an accounting issue, where a lot of the debt that was incurred, borrowings that were taken by FCI were not accounted for, and they brought that into the accounting book. So that's just an aberration. So imagine that isn't there, and now it's at $220 billion. So it is large, 13% of fiscal deficit and 5% of the total government budget. But is it too large? I think there the issue is whether the costs exceed the benefits. I think there are a lot of aspects to this costs exceeding the benefits. It can come from operational efficiencies, like the costs of actually maintaining a stock, distributing, leakages. And so historically in the 80s and 90s, they said 1 rupee worth grain takes 365 to transfer. There are many numbers that range between 1.5 and 9 rupees. I won't go into those details, but what I've tried to do is to re-estimate these along with some co-authors for the last 25 years, and that will be the main focus of what I'm going to say. Our premise is that this it ignores the coupled nature of the system, where there are farmers also part of it, and there are consumers. And the other idea is that all of these costs are just referring to budgetary food subsidy, which is the cost to the government, but it's not really, doesn't really say anything about the benefits that are transferred. And you need a proper accounting of the benefits, both to farmers as well as consumers. And I'll show you some results which actually change things quite a bit. So what are these cost components of procurement? If you look at it, a bulk of it is actually compensation to farmers for the grains they supply. That's the black column here. And the procurement incidentals are 25%. 13% are excess stocks that are just held by the government. So this is the cost structure. So what we do is we say, what is a budgetary subsidy? The government spends money in procuring and carrying, and then distribution costs, but they are recovering some of it from the state governments as central issue price. So this is what you see as budgetary food subsidy, but it's often conflated with this is the benefits consumers get. And we are departing from that view to say, let's define an economic subsidy, which is the price of grain that consumers would have to pay in the retail market, minus what they actually pay if they were to buy from the PDS, multiplied by the offtake, which is the volume that goes to the consumers. And the mirror image of that is, if I'm a farmer selling to the procurement system, what is the MSP and what would I have got if I'd sold in the wholesale market, and how much is procured. And we are going to add these two and compare it to this and call this the true measure of benefits, and this being the cost to the government. So this is the way we are going to compute it. What's the picture you get? Okay, so on the left is wheat, the right side is right. And we are talking about consumers first. If you look at the last 20 odd years, this is the PDS price, and now of course it's free. And this has been the retail price in the market. Very clearly you see the extent of buffering the PDS has offered consumers. So consequently this difference means that the net transfers or economic subsidy to consumers of wheat has grown substantially. Same thing with rice. What's the story for farmers though? Look at the prices of MSP and the wholesale price, more or less going hand in hand. Quite a big difference for rice in some years. And look at the bars. So most of it is positive for wheat, but net tax. So they are actually, MSP is lower than what they would have got had they sold in the open market. For rice, it's actually larger than, so it's mostly net taxed. And for those of you following debates, the OECD report came up with that number that Indian farmers are net taxed. This is what they mean, that the government intervention is at a price that's lower than what they would have got had they been open to private trade or international trade. So the net effect of this is still positive. So you see that the budget says this is the subsidy, but the total benefit is actually much higher. So when you compute a ratio, you're not spending 3 rupees 65 price to transfer a rupee. In fact, it looks quite okay that actually you're transferring to transfer a rupee worth benefit, you're only spending 70 pies. And this is actually the reverse. For every rupee you spend, the benefit on average is 1.29, including both farmers and consumers. Now the thing is, what happens to leakages and excess stock holding? And we do a multiple set of estimates to show that actually if you have leakages, it virtually wipes out this and makes costs and benefits virtually equal. Likewise, holding on to excess storing has the same effect. So this is all I have to say about how expensive it is. I'll very quickly go over the rest since that was the main new finding. Here I'm just putting together previous research we've done. Now the procurement system, one criticism was that only 6% of farmers get it. Yes, they do. But when you actually say farmers who sell to the agency as percentage of those who sold anything, or those with any marketed surplus, or anyone who's growing rice or wheat, you can see this range of estimates. So pretty much like the threshold for the norms, you can sort of change the denominator and get a very different story of the reach of the procurement system. The other thing is the geographies. So over time, you see that the traditional procurement states for rice and wheat, I won't go into which states are included, but these were the original contributors to the procurement system. They have fallen quite substantially over the years. And this is another way of saying the same thing. Now we are getting rice and wheat from very diverse geographies. So this is the Heffendal-Hirschman index, which is an index of concentration. So if you get everything from one state, the number is going to be 1. And so you see that decline. So now more diverse geographies are supplying to it. I'll skip this slide. This is actually a paper in the RAS, where we show using NSA situation assessment survey that this idea of large farmer bias is not entirely true. So here you see that anywhere the curve is downward sloping, that means that small farmers have a disproportionately large contribution to the procurement system, more than their share in the number of cultivators. So you see that actually Haryana, which you associate with large farmers supplying wheat, it's actually quite progressive in the sense that small farmers are disproportionately contributing to the procurement system. So even this idea that it's pro-large farmer, it's true in some places, but not entirely true. The other issue has been the cost of procurement. I think in the inaugural days, somebody talked about how MSP doesn't cover C2 plus 50%. I'm using A2. This is a bit dated, but you see that across states, in some states it covers the MSP and in others it doesn't. So right now, this idea that it's towards diversification is also not borne out by evidence. We don't, a colleague of mine, Prankur Gupta, has done this work at the national level, suggesting that because there's procurement system, there is no evidence of acreage under other crops shrinking. In fact, he finds that in fruits and vegetables, it may have actually increased. And we are currently doing some work in Orissa, where we find that actually they are not competing with each other. Vegetables are grown on, we are looking just at the case of vegetables. Rice and vegetables are grown on very different lands, and there is an indent system which limits how much you can supply. And our hypothesis is that the procurement system offers an insurance mechanism for farmers, so they're able to expose themselves to greater risks and to high-value crops or vegetables in this case. So I'll conclude with this two things. The WTO challenge, so far we've been protected by the peace clause. I won't go into this in detail. Our consumer subsidies, that is benefits to consumers, falls in the green box. The subsidy to the farmers that we calculated comes in the amber box. And for the last 5 years, actually, based on the WTO approach to computing the measure of support, we are flouting the rules. But the problem is not us. The problem is the way the WTO asks you to calculate the measure of support. I'm happy to talk about that later on. The last issues are that finding evidence for cash transfers. We've had a decade-old project by JPAL and Microsave Consulting that's implemented DBT in lieu of PDS in some union territories. Their paper is called Some Success and a Few Issues, and private conversations with them will tell you it should have been called No Success and Lots of Issues. But I think that's important to know. Again, I won't talk about what they found, but they essentially found that it didn't really fly well. And so they're continuing to do these experiments until they find some case for cash transfers. I think the whole point of this evidence-based policy is that it neglects the political economy aspects. I think India's already experienced international trade, depending on international trade for food security, which was very problematic, after which one politician said it's non-negotiable, which is our stand in the WTO. The food price crisis, the COVID-19 have all cemented this idea that we need an in-kind distribution that's ready to run. And in many states, it's a political priority. I'll conclude with this sentiment in Tamil Nadu, where they said that the Tamil Nadu government won't last that afternoon if they touch the PDS. And I think that's the nature of political demands. And that's why you see today that a government that would have been willingly moved the system to a cash transfer, is now giving free food grains. So I'll stop there. I apologize for taking more time.
Oh, okay, okay. Is it better? Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I would like to, before I begin, I would like to thank the Foundation for Agrarian Studies for giving me the opportunity to work, which is, as the title says, housing conditions and the access to basic amenities. It's a longitudinal study carried out by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies through the 2 rounds of village studies in the state of Uttar Pradesh. So I'm going to take you through some of the findings that we have, which I have put here on selected indicators of housing and amenities. The study is of how housing has improved over these 2 rounds. That the first one was conducted in 2006. In 2 villages of Uttar Pradesh, and the second one was 2 years back in 2023. Now, we take here selected items of amenities as well, such as electricity, domestic water, and sanitation facilities, along with the housing. Now, while we discuss the improvements or the changes that have occurred between these 2 rounds from 2006 and 2023, we also look at the overall situation as well as the inequalities which continues to exist across social groups. So it's not necessarily a comparison between the 2 villages which are in different regions. As you can see here, Harevali village, which is situated in Najibabad district, Najibabad Tehsil of Bijnor district, which is western Uttar Pradesh, and was surveyed in 2006 as a census of all households. And in 2023, it was again a census. And the other village, which is Mehetwar in the eastern Uttar Pradesh, Rasra Tehsil of Balia, which is Purvanchal, again was studied in 2006 as a census and in 2023 as a sample. So we would just cover a few points that these 2 rounds of surveys show us in terms of improvement or the existing situations with regards to housing. Now that is the that side on the screen. You would be able to see 2006 round statistics, and this one on the left side is 2023. The middle row, which is in bold, is the percentage. So better indicator to understand this would be to look at the percentages and not the numbers that much. I have tried to give here the improvements that have occurred between these 2 rounds, which is close to 16 to 17 years apart. And there is a significant improvement across all social groups here. That is, if we look at the total numbers, the Pakka housing. Here, the Pakka housing, the way we have defined it here is a little different than what census and the NSS does. Census and NSS, they take the housing construction material used in roof and the wall of the structure. What we have done here as an additional component that we have included the construction material used in the floor also, which it gives a better and all-rounded understanding of the condition of the housing structure. So we consider it as a better definition or criteria to assess the housing condition. We see here that overall, where it was 17% Pakka houses in 2006, this proportion became a little more than half in the village of Harevli, and it has substantially increased across social groups, including the OBCs, the Muslims, and the scheduled caste households, where you see the improvements are quite visible. The second criteria that we have taken for housing conditions is the availability of living space or availability of rooms in the housing structure, which is that we have taken the households which lived in single room structures. So if you see the drop in the percentages, which is a good sign, that means lesser proportion of households are now staying in single room structures. That means the residents or the habitants of those houses have more space, for sleeping and for other purposes of storage and etc. This proportion has declined across the social groups. If you compare it, from 2006 and 2023, so lesser proportion of households here across the social groups are staying in single room structures. Now this is an indicator of toilet facilities, that is access to toilets within the household. We have taken the the toilet facilities which are available to the households exclusively, and they are not shared with anybody else, or they are not public toilets. Harevli didn't have a provision of public toilets. The other village had a provision of public toilets. We are going to come to that. So if we see here, it's a almost 100% coverage of toilet facilities in this village, where it was little higher than 1/3 of the total households in 2006. So we see this improvement particularly among the households belonging to Muslim community and scheduled caste, which it was 5% in the first round, and now it came almost 100% in 2023. It's a huge achievement. It's a huge change which is visible here. We have also data on the use of the toilet, and it is almost same as the availability. So there isn't a significant proportion that have fallen back to open defecation. This particular village was notorious in terms of Dalits being humiliated for accessing open spaces for defecation or using upper caste, cropland, etc. So particularly the residents belonging to marginalized caste, etc., were under attack, regularly. So assistance provided through sanitation programs, etc., has made a positive impact there. Now, if we look at the electricity, again, this village has almost covered 100% electricity in the latest round, which was 2023. Again, this village, the Dalit settlement in this village in the round which was conducted in 2006 was totally cut off from the piped water drinking facility as well as the electricity provision. There was only 1 or 2 households among the scheduled caste households who had taken electricity connection. Now this has changed, and this settlement where Dalit households belonging to the Chamar caste particularly live have got the electricity connection provision there. Now, source within household, again, this is something that the Dalit households or households belonging to different castes earlier had made provisions of their own in terms of hand pumps, etc. This Dalit village settlement was not served by the public drinking water supply, and households were forced to invest into their own drinking water facilities, that is, to install a hand pump on their own, because the Panchayat was not serving this settlement. The village which is close to the Dalit settlement had refused to serve the Dalit households in this village, and the teachers used to chase away those who went to collect water there. And there was only one single hand pump in that Dalit settlement, which was defunct for many years, and nobody, bothered to repair it. Now, that situation is like more or less that households had already covered their own individual household provision, drinking water provision exist. We have tried to come up with an integrated housing indicator here by putting housing, pakka house, at least 2 rooms in the housing, and provision of electricity connection, lavatory, and a source of water within homestead. We call it integrated housing. That means it's not just shows you the type of structure or it's whether it's kacha or pakka in terms of material which has been used in construction, but it gives you an idea of how good or how bad it serves to in terms of those who live in it with regards to the provision or the presence of certain amenities. We see there is a significant increase here, but continues to remain highly inadequate when we look at the total numbers in the latest round from 2023. It has increased from the last round from 13% to 38% in the latest round, and the improvements we see are pretty striking in terms of other backward households which had 0 proportion. None of the households in the 2006 round had met this criteria. Now close to 1/5 of those households have these this kind of housing. Similarly, among Muslims, if we look at the numbers, out of 9 households, 2 households have now made it to this condition, and improvements are again almost doubled among the caste Hindu households, which are Dhimwar, which are not Dhimwar, these are the Tyagi households in this village, upper caste households. Among scheduled caste also there is a change in that the households have made provision of some of these amenities along with pakka housing. Now this was the situation in terms of residential segregation in this village in 2023 and 2012, when I had gone for a revisit to the village after the 2006 round data collection, and this paper then was published in the Review of Agrarian Studies in 2015. So we see that the residential segregation or the geographical isolation of the Dalit households continue to remain intact, and there's no change with regards to households being residing in different parts of the villages. So the caste clustering on the basis of caste remains a reality also in 2023. We see that the Chamar households, which are the Dalit households, live on the one part of the extreme north side of the village, which is also true in 2023. The middle part of the village or the village geography has been occupied by the Dhivar and the Tyagi households, which is also the land which is on slight elevation and on a higher high land, while the Chamar settlement is a lowland area which gets flooded every year with the excessive water from the nearby croplands. So this remains. There is a change in the village accessibility as we enter the village. The picture you see on the right side is from 2012 visit, which shows the entrance into the village was marked by this very, very difficult situation to navigate here in terms of the mud and the swamp. And this has changed with the introduction or with the building of the construction of the concrete road in the village, at the village entrance. Now we see the 2015 paper covers some of these cases where households were living in really, really crowded housing along with the animals that they had, and hardly there was any separation of animal quarters from the living quarters. Now this picture is from 2012, where a household is sharing a very close proximity to the animals or the cattle they had. Now in 2023, during my revisit to this village, after the FAS team had collected data, I went there a few months later than that, and I noticed the same households now had given this or uses this structure only for keeping the cattle there, and they have moved to a house which looks much better in this particular case, which was a focus in the paper, which is there in the 2015 in RAS. So I couldn't gather more information on this because the male members of the household were not there and they were out for work. So there was a problem in terms of getting information how this improvement have been achieved. Now, if we look at the situation overall, there seems to be a visible improvement in the housing, but there are also a lot of households which continue to remain with very ad hoc and very temporary arrangements of housing using tarpaulin and tin sheets and the kacha unburnt bricks, etc. mud material for housing construction. This is the situation in the Dalit settlement. These are both pictures from the latest round, which is 2023, and again a very striking difference in terms of the neighborhood infrastructure or the streets, etc., which are pakka in the Tyagi neighborhood. And this is actually house of the current sarpanch, where it has, a pakka house with, char diwari and all that. But you look at the, drainage right in front of the Pradhan's house. Difference in terms of availability of homestead land. Dalit households are really, really cramped into a small settlement, high proportion. They share a small homestead land part of the village, and the Tyagi households have huge open spaces in this village. Now I'm going to quickly cover in the next 4 to 5 minutes. No, 3 minutes? Okay, 3 minutes. Mehetwar. Which is again telling the same story. There is improvement in pakka housing between these two rounds. From 15% to close to 35%. Again, all social groups in the village showing some improvement in housing. Rooms, again, a decline in single room structures. Actually, in this village, the room story is a little different, that it's not so much has changed here because the house split in the households has caused more crowding within the household because the household or the homestead was then shared by the two families. Now, toilets have improved. Electricity has again from 53% to close to 100%. This village also had a higher incidence of unauthorized electricity connections in 2006, which again constitute a substantial proportion here, which is close to 40% households still access electricity without a legal electricity meter or a connection. Water has improved. Integrated housing, integrated housing has shown improvement with the increase in households having water, toilets, and pakka housing, which shows from 2% to 26% change in across caste groups and the social groups in Mehetwar. This village also tells the same story in terms of residential segregation. The map which you see here is from the 2023 round, prepared by Setu, my colleague here from the foundation team. It shows that this is the mixed settlement, which you see in brown, which has non-Dalit households here, and the blue part in this image, which you see, is the predominantly or exclusively a Dalit settlement, marked very segregatedly, by a patch of land in between. And public utilities, there is a public toilet facility here which is not being used by anybody in the village, but it exists there. So the conclusions I don't have to repeat. There is an improvement, visible improvement across social groups. Inequalities across social groups also continues to be striking, And the overall quality remains far from being adequate or satisfactory if we look at the overall situation in these villages regards to personal as well as public or the social infrastructure. Caste-based residential segregation continues to remain a reality in village India in the 21st century, which doesn't allow too much of an interaction and intermingling or social intercourse between different castes and communities. That's it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Shamsher. It shows major positive changes, but a lot more to go, and inequalities remain based on social groups when it comes to housing in rural India. So may I invite Professor Nagaraj for the last presentation, which is he will be explaining.
Yeah, thank you, Jayan. Good afternoon. Yeah, I have a very short presentation and very tentative presentation, and the empirical evidence I show is fairly known, but what I want to focus on is the suggestions I'm making, which may have some value, and I would like to get response from knowledgeable people here. Yeah, this is I've been all along talking about import dependence in manufacturing, but agriculture also has a similar problem. So that's what I want to focus on. Just a snapshot. This is most known facts, but just yeah. In 24-25, India produced 354 million tons of food grains. India is a net food exporter, exporting $46 billion worth of food grains and importing 32 billion. So India is a net exporter of food. India is now world's largest exporter of rice, displacing China, Thailand, and a significant exporter of meat and meat products. Annual growth rate of food grains has gradually inched up to 4%. From around 3% in the early Green Revolution decades, a significant achievement. Compare it with the mid-1960s, when India survived from ship to mouth, depending on the US aid. So I think we have come a long way. The output composition has shifted towards greater value-added products like dairy milk, fish, and poultry, suggesting changing composition of demand. There is, however, questions about possible overestimation of milk output. I think that's what a lot of people seem to say. That's going at the fastest rate. I think there are more agricultural experts here. They can correct me if I'm wrong. The flip side of it is the growing dependence on imports of critical nutritional requirements such as pulses, oilseeds, and also for fertilizers from the input side. Yeah, this is what is my concern. These items are the principal reason for food inflation, whose management is critical for meeting the inflation target and macro stability. I mean, this is the link I want to draw from import dependence to macro policy. Okay? India's productivity for most crops remain below the global average. This is a fairly well-known fact. Okay? Fertilizer production usage per unit of land still lags. Imports are fine. I'm not against it. I'm not asking for autarky. No. In fact, there should be reasonable role for foreign trade. Okay. But if there is a sporadic demand-supply gaps caused by weather or short-term factors, importing is perfectly acceptable. However, persistent and rising deficits in supply and rising subsidies are surely a cause for concern for macro management. That's my concern. Okay? In other words, persistent dependence on imports, critical inputs, or food grains is a sign of national vulnerability, especially in times of changing geopolitics. That's what brings me to this question immediately. Okay. Yeah, government policy. Government is offering minimum support price. I think Sudha mentioned those in detail, for procurement of pulses and oilseeds. However, MSP for pulses and oilseeds have mostly not worked. And as public procurement is limited, which in turn may be constrained by lack of timely market interventions of storage and transportation, for lack of storage and market facilities. Sorry, there is a mistake. Okay, this is important. I mean, if you imagine when we had this food, I mean, immediately after Green Revolution, they set up an entire institution structure. It's not just MSP, but you had the transport facilities, you had storage facilities, and more importantly, there was the public sector banks which are funding FCI had unlimited access to credit. I mean, that's very important. No, there is no budget constraint for food procurement. Today, the situation is very different for if you want to increase procurement of pulses and oilseeds. Okay, Trade reports suggest market prices of oilseeds often fall below because of imports. Imports mostly undertaken by private trade and is a market-driven activity. I mean, earlier days, again, please don't, I'm not saying everything was wonderful in the previous days, no. But government had a greater control. These items were canalized items. It was imported by government, so it could control the prices and quantities which were being imported. But today, it's a market-driven activity. Okay. The ASEAN Free Trade Agreement signed in 2009 allowed for duty-free imports of palm oil, palm fruit to reduce, to augment supply and control food inflation, which seems to have affected incentives for domestic production of oilseed crops. Also perhaps true for non-fruit crops such as natural rubber. I think this the FTA with ASEAN countries has affected food security in many ways. Of course, from a consumer point of view, the prices have been under control, no doubt. But from the production point of view, it has affected. Okay, oilseeds, soybean serves two objectives. Yeah, this is important. Soybean is unique that it's not supplying oil seeds, but also nutrition, which is often forgotten when we talk about soybean. Okay. Soya output has been stagnant for the last 4 years, and the imports are rising. Okay. Domestic production is affected due to stagnant yields, shift in acreage to more profitable crops of wheat and rice, and there are environmental concerns. Okay. If imports are further liberalized under the currently ongoing tariff negotiations with the US, it could further affect soya production. Pulses, imports constitute about 10% of pulses consumption in the aggregate. Its imports in 24-25 was at a 9-year high. I think the figures are there. Okay. However, the composition and shortage of imports could diverge, accentuating the price rise. India allows duty-free imports of pulses, which are often priced much below MSP. And Indian productivity is lower as they are mostly grown in marginal and unirrigated lands. I think a lot of it is known facts. I did not, yeah. Okay. Fertilizers. About 30% of domestic consumption of fertilizer is imported. The ratio, the ratio has not declined much during the last 10 years or so. India is mostly self-sufficient in nitrogenous fertilizer, that is urea, with imports forming about 14% of consumption in 24-25. Okay, but highly dependent on potassium and phosphatic fertilizers as we lack the natural resource material. Efforts to set up factories in the source countries for assured supply haven't been very successful. Rising urea demand is partly due to price controls and price frozen at the 2013 level. The rational pricing could moderate the demand, reduce the misuse of fertilizer. I know those of you who support fertilizer subsidies may be up in arms against what I'm saying, but I think there is a need for a more rational use of it. Okay, price controls are right, but I think they have some relationship to the market prices. Okay. demand is increasingly for complex fertilizers, that is combination of NP and K, like DAP, which are largely imported. Example is water-soluble fertilizers used in grape cultivation, whose sole supplier is China and has a chokehold on its supplies. The other concern is a lot of it, our dependency is on China, which I see is a serious geopolitical threat. Okay. News reports suggest imports are restricted from China, which leads to shortages in the peak season, sowing season, as was recently reported from Telangana and Karnataka. India reportedly imports 80% of soluble fertilizers, which are supplied by China-controlled pesticide company Syngenta. Yeah, the crux of the problem is lack of adequate investment to augment domestic production. Again, it goes back to my problem about inadequate aggregate investment. This is an example of it. Since 2020 or so, 5 public sector fertilizer plants of the erstwhile Fertilizer Corporation of India in Eastern India were revived with natural gas as feedstock, but these are the 5, 6 mentioned here, and but they have not come to full capacity. There seems to be a lot of announcements by the government, but what's happening at the ground level, we don't seem to be knowing enough. I think that seems to be a problem which is increasing our fertilizer dependency. Coal gasification technology was apparently ruled out as technology was considered unproven. Again, this goes back to the whole earlier debate about having technological self-reliance in fertilizers. Just to give an idea, just to give a sense of perspective, in 1985, India and China were both dependent on the Western countries for fertilizer and its technology. Okay, but today China has technology and is a major exporter, whereas we are dependent on both imports and its technology. One of the reported reasons for poor performance was dependence on China for technology and turnkey execution. Yeah, I think I understand, again, by going by newspaper reports, that after 2020 Galwan crisis, when India put restrictions on Chinese imports, China has tightened the screw against supplying equipment and technology for Indian fertilizer plants. Okay, a way out, conclusion. This is my main point. Rising import dependence in agriculture, both the output and inputs are a matter of concern, which I think I need not emphasize further. Fertilizer production is constrained by investment and technology. Production of oilseeds and pulses low or stagnant productivity, inadequate policy support. Why? Here is my hypothesis. Okay, a disconnect between agricultural and import policies. Imports target domestic availability to meet the inflation target. Imports determine the market prices, which are often below MSP. It seems redundant. The MSP is redundant due to lack of adequate market intervention and infrastructure to support storage and transportation. Let me explain this. I see there is a disconnect between the Finance Ministry, Commerce Ministry combined, following, controlling imports, and their target is to keep the inflation under control, because they have to meet the inflation target. Whereas Agriculture Ministry announces MSP, but without adequate support, and therefore it remains a loose link in the policy making circle. So I think there's a disconnect. The government, which is wedded to what they call market fiscal orthodoxy, or basically keeping the macro stability, they're only bothered about inflation, balance of payment, and fiscal deficit. So to keep fiscal deficit under control and to keep balance of payment under control, food inflation is important. They are not bothered about food production, but they are about food availability. And food availability, they can manage very well using the imports. And for which Agriculture Ministry hardly comes into play. On paper it may, but in effect, it probably does not. I think this is my reading of how policy making is happening today. Okay, so So my suggestion is there's a need to set up independent tariff commission, which will decide the tariffs on imports of inputs and outputs, and where all stakeholders in the economy will get adequate representation, or they get a voice in tariff commission. Today, it's a small group of bureaucrats and political leaders who take decisions regarding imports. That is the Commerce Ministry, Finance Ministry, and RBI. So I think the policy-making scope has to be expanded, where the interests of farmers have to be brought in. So I think there is a need for a tariff commission. Just to, again, historically, we had tariff commission during the colonial period, and it was, in the post-independence, we did not have tariff commission. We had something called BICP, Bureau of Costs and Prices, which was not independent, yet it was able to pull together various voices and gave a platform for various voices to be heard. I think today, after the reforms, I think we require an independent tariff commission, as many other countries have. So this is my session. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nagaraj, for that very important presentation and proposal for independent tariff commission. And if I understand correctly, probably India has got it right, if I understand correctly, with both respect to public procurement of food grains and MSP when it comes to rice and wheat, but you are explaining here a picture of oil seeds and pulses and many others where there's an absence of policy, absence of a coherent trade policy and also industrial policy when it comes to fertilizer production. So thank you. We have some time for discussion, 30 minutes, I guess. So please, we can, there is time. Sridhar.
Thank you for these. I could sit through two of the presentations because I was in another one. There's a problem with these parallel sessions. Shamsher's thing about the housing market, I don't think we should be surprised about this given the state of India. I mean, this is what happens in urban, forget about Mahatwar and these places. You go to Bombay or you go to Delhi, you go to Bangalore, anywhere, communities are not free to, even the market, despite the market, you can't move. So relocation within the village is completely, I mean, it is to be expected. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'm not surprised by that. About Dr. Nagaraj's paper, just it's not the main thing, but the rice trade to me is what we call the surplus, Indian surplus in international trade in cereals, is very tenuous, I think, because it's just, just in the last few years. And the quantities are not very large. It's not a big thing. But it's also the rice trade, unlike the wheat trade, is far more, the demand-supply gap in the international market is far tighter. It's much tighter. So the scope for year-to-year entry into that market is, I mean, India has not been a long-term player in that game for very long. It's a track record. It doesn't have much of a track record. It's only in the last few years. So I don't think we have yet arrived there.
Yeah, my question is to Sudha. Your RAS paper is tremendously useful, but my question was that when we are arguing that MSP is reaching a larger farmer percentage population, and that traditional states, we are moving away from the geographies are changing, expanding, but it is again based on two crops of rice and wheat, majorly rice actually. And this is happening because of shift, and rice, we know there are ecological issues associated with it. For example, cotton is going into rice and things like that is happening. So when we are actually arguing in a way to support that subsidies are not that much or can expand or there is the positive nature of the subsidies, aren't we we also have to kind of state that this probably in the longer run has some detrimental effects on agriculture, keeping in view the difficulties with expansion of rice. Yeah.
Extremely insightful and very engaging session. Thank you very much. All the papers were very good. Mike, a couple of queries I have. One is for you, Brinda. You called it as a puzzle. You said that the shift that we see between 22-23 and 23-24, sudden change that you see in terms of nutritional security, may it be for cereals, may it be for micro cereals as you call them. So what explains that? You called it as a puzzle and you said that you're looking at it, but because it's just a year period, 1 year period, what could possibly explain such a shift? Because the two surveys methodologically, according to me, are similar. There is no, between 11-12 and 22-23, there is a big change, but 22-23 and 23-24, there isn't any change. So what explains this sudden drop or sudden change that I wanted to ask? A comment on this thing, you said that this 22-23 and 23-24 capture the post-COVID, that Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan, whatever Yojana, etc., right? But what Madhura was saying yesterday while discussing Sophie, she said that 23, 22 and 20, these two last HCES, they captured the freely available goods also, food items, which were not in fact captured in 11-12. So I think it's not just the COVID effect, but it's also that the surveys were designed in such a manner that we captured the freely available food grains. So possibly, I mean, that's just a comment because in terms of, it's not just the availability as part of COVID, but also in terms of the way the surveys were designed. I feel that they automatically capture that part. And yet you say that there is a drop. So that really is worrisome, and I get that. Shamsher, about you, of course your findings I am aware of, I have been reading your work. What is your take on the PM Awas Yojana? Because on that I have heard, and there hasn't been a very systematic study on that. The amount of subsidy that's available is, I think, 1,20,000. I don't think in rural areas that is adequate, but you correct me because you have been looking at this area, so you probably are more aware of it. So please help me understand or throw some light about what do you think is the effectiveness and whether that scheme is working. Because in states like West Bengal and all, it has been a game changer in terms of the results that you see at the ground level in terms of, the traction that it has had in the rural areas. Has that been the case even for UP? I wanted to understand. And Nagaraj sir, yes, your point about policy disconnect is very well taken. You said that when deciding the policies, we look at the consumers and we look at the inflation. Yes, very correct, because we are concerned about consumer inflation when we talk about inflation targeting. So we do focus on that. When it comes to, however, the MSP, fixing of MSP, you said that we probably follow another yardstick or whatever. There is a disconnect. I don't think so, because even while fixing MSP, sir, ultimately we are also bothered about inflation, because when we try to track inflation in rural areas, we look at rural wages, we look at MSP inflation. So what I'm trying to say is that even there, the concern of inflation is very much there. So it's not like MSP is decided keeping in view farmers' interests and in fact, for that matter, the A2, C2 debate. That again brings us back whether indeed MSPs are also adequate to cover the cost of cultivation. So what I'm trying to say is that yes, there is a focus on consumers, I agree, but when it comes to fixing MSPs also, there is very much a focus on inflation. Inflation is paramount, or that's something that is underlying even while fixing MSPs, according to me. That's my reading, because we track it in that manner. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm not an economist. My response will be as a biologist, and I'm very happy to listen to the talk by Dr. Nagarajan. When you talk of import dependence of oil seeds and pulses and also, fertilizers. And we have been working on, as a scientist in the area of biotechnology, working on very rigorously to increase productivity of both pulses as well as oil seeds. And just to inform you now, of course, we have a Government of India policy and scheme on pulses to increase production at least by 10 more million tons, in coming 5 to 7 years, and with a focus on 3 pulse crops, which is pigeon pea, lentil, and black gram. And that's going to really help us, I believe. But you are very right that the global productivity average, if you compare with India is really lagging behind. There's no doubt about it. We need to increase that productivity. But I was also very happy to listen to you, with regard to the fertilizers, kind of import. But I think we would like to add. So the point I'm trying to make is that we need to work together with researchers. Like you get a very good message for the policymakers. But I believe research is also need to be guided by people like you. Not only that we must increase productivity, we must try to increase all those latest tools of biotechnology. We cannot do away without it. For example, when you talk of genetic modification or today genome editing, I mentioned in my presentation in the morning if you're there. So what I'm saying is, and also now we have addition of biofertilizers coming a big way, because India has announced a biomanufacturing, Bio-E3 policy. Under that Bio-E3 policy, a lot of emphasis given on biomanufacturing, including biologicals or biofertilizers, which are going to replace to some extent, I'm sure, even synthetic fertilizers. But your point is very well taken, and that we need to really work together. And I think there could be an action plan. I would request that together, if we work with researchers like us, not only for intervention by the policymakers, even for researchers. Because the ultimate goal is to really speaking help the farmers, the economy of the country, and both consumers. And we should come out of this problem of import dependence. It's really very bad. I mean, as an Indian, I feel it's really, when you compare particularly with China, we must really be surging ahead with all the technology research. We should be developing inside indigenously here. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very interesting session, and I have small questions for all the papers. I may have misunderstood, but Professor Viswanathan, you showed that the availability of basic foods had gone down from 2011 to 2023, 3 kilos to 1.8 for millet, 6 to 3.7 for rice, 5 bit less to 4.5 for wheat. And you also showed that, according to the norms, the amount of poverty in the dimension of fat had gone down hugely. So I have a very simple question. Is the ratio of total calorie consumption from fat compensating for the drop in calorie consumption from cereals? It wasn't really possible from the way the data was presented to know whether that's the case. Otherwise, it looks as though calorie availability has gone down very seriously over this period, and that's a big finding that needs discussing. To Sudha and also to Shamsher, 2 questions on waste. One is that during the conference, several speakers have talked about waste in the food system being of the order of 30 to 40%. I don't believe this, but if it were 30 to 40%, how would it affect the cost, the way in which the subsidies are attributed? And for Shamsher, again, when we're looking at rural well-being, and when you now go to visit villages in India, you cannot not be aware of the growing amount of non-biodegradable waste. So there's a general problem which all economies have. We all produce waste. India deals with its waste in a very inefficient way. There was a paper in Nature suggesting that India's waste is going to grow in absolute terms for the next century before efficiencies in packaging and things like that not come in, play in. So why do all the studies of rural welfare and infrastructure and utilities forget waste and waste disposal? And to Professor Nagaraj, you proposed at the end, very reasonably, a tariff commission that was independent. And I'm sitting thinking of a knee-jerk response to tariffs, which is, how do you Trump-proof an independent tariff commission? Well, and so behind that is a question, how does America's tariff war play on international prices and would play into a rational approach to India's computations of tariffs. And a corollary to that question is you talked about fractured, complicated bureaucratic architecture, and we can all well believe that. But it's even more complicated if you take pulses and oilseeds in their totality, because earlier you were talking about, when you were talking about MSPs, you were talking about the huge logistical problems of putting in a public procurement system for pulses and oilseeds. So you have all the other departments of government that are involved in policy for not just research, infrastructure, logistics. All of that comes into planning an MSP. You made that point. It's a very useful point. So as well as the complicated bureaucratic architecture that you well understand for pricing, you have all this other complexity involved. And I wonder how you and members of this audience feel one tackles that problem of institutional complexity in policy making.
Sorry, I won't be long. Nagaraj, I was impressed by your suggestion that we must have a tariff commission. But then, what was our good old APC, Agricultural Prices Commission, all about? They decided the MSPs, which were, let me say, they were heavily biased in favor of two major crops, and we procured them, sustaining the prices, and we generally ignored the dryland crops and the pulses, for which it did not go in for any procurement price, so much so the production has slumped, and especially for the millets which we passionately talk about, they are essentially dryland crops. The fact of the matter is, whenever irrigation facilities improved, people naturally shifted to these two remunerative, highly remunerative crops, the rice and wheat, and I'm for keeping them remunerative. I missed Sudha Narayanan's presentation, so for therefore let me not go into that. I've always been a passionate proponent of high MSPs and subsidized prices, both to be organized by the state without leaving pricing to the international markets. We have our own rationale for keeping the MSP high or low, but more importantly, keeping the public distribution system intact with subsidized prices. And I think policy should be geared to catering both, meeting both these objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the session. I had one question to Professor Nagaraj. Actually, if you look at the MSP and price realized by farmers, especially for pulses and oilseeds, for the last few years, we see a big difference. The prices are much lower, but announcement as MSP is quite high. But if you look at a few years before, when there was a drought and the pulse prices were quite high, it was as if like there was no need for MSP, the price were already quite high. That was the kind of argument. But we all know that farm incomes were not very high. So I think in terms of import substitution and then having some self-reliance, it makes sense. But without, even with very high prices, without actually solving the issue of yields, because the pulse yields and oilseed yields are very low, farm income may not be that, it may not improve. That was my observation. So just wanted to share it. Thank you.
Thank you. I was surprised at the response my very tentative proposal has given. Yeah. Yeah. The first is about, true, MSP is, I know RBI would keep, but let's face it, MSP's decision is a prerogative of the Agriculture Ministry. And they are supposed to have this APC, as Jose rightly mentioned, but APC seems to have been diluted, that's my understanding. So, in the fixing of MSP, RBI's role is much less. I mean, it takes MSP as given, by and large. Correct me, that's my understanding. Okay, and they're only saying, given this, they see how much you procure, and finance ministries and commerce ministry will see if there is a deficit, they'll increase the import tap. And their target is domestic availability, not domestic production, which is sad. I think we must think of domestic production. I mean, that's my view, because so I feel there is a disconnect. I mean, say Agriculture Ministry makes a popular political statement. Look, we are supporting farmers, but in effect they are not. That's my concern. So I'm sure you share my concern. Okay, that's first point. Yeah, I think the technology argument is absolutely right. I think all of us know, I think most of us know here, look, the real problem is technology in sense, productivity of non-rice, rice, excluding rice and wheat, productivity of most crops have not increased very much. And there's a technological barrier there. And also, let's face it, storing of pulses and particularly the millets is hard. They can't be stored for too long. They can be stored at best for about 12 months. That's my understanding. They cannot, unlike wheat, which can be stored for a much longer period. So there are technological problems of storing. I mean, so therefore the crux of the matter is, look, we have to increase productivity, and I think as Ramkumar rightly mentioned in the morning, I think there's a disconnect between our economic policy establishment and the scientific establishment. And I think, there has to be, we have to find ways of connecting the two. I agree with Jose that, look, we have to supply remunerative prices. But let's face it, it has to have some relation. If you believe that we are an open economy, okay, our prices must have some relationship to foreign prices. I mean, border prices are important. Let's face it. We are not living in autarky. Okay, that's something, you may say I'm a trade, I believe in domestic-led growth, but we must not ignore the foreign prices. Otherwise, it leads to wastage. I mean, if you lead to high, if you have high MSP and subsidized food grains, it can lead to loss of wastage. In fact, there are concerns, I don't know the exact details, maybe others may know. The urea is being misused for other purposes. I don't know exactly what purposes, but it's being misused today because its prices are 1/3 the price of other fertilizers. Okay, so I'm not saying that cut down the entire fertilizer subsidy. You may cut the fertilizer subsidy on urea and maybe redistribute it to others, or use the same amount of money for augmenting domestic production and technology rather than for a subsidy. So I think we need to use that amount of money which you want to spend for agricultural purpose should be better used. That would be my suggestion. So have I missed anything? Neither. Professor Harris, Barbara Harris, I agree. The problem is that our non-food crops, pulses and groundnuts, pulses and oil seeds, productivity growth has not been good enough, and that has been the problem. Have I missed anything? Last point, you said yes, that we need to increase the supply of investment in technology to get this going. Okay, to get our production, augmenting production. Anything I missed? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions and the comments. I have received, there are 3 questions for me. I'll take the first one, which is a comment by my friend Sridhar. And I would really like politely like to disagree, with the observation that there is no movement of residencies within the village geographies. And what we have seen it, we have shown it in our writings that this is not a secular segregation or a separation of just households living in different localities. It is a very caste-based segregation, which I think was also your point. But we see that there is a lot of mobility within the village. People moving from older houses, older constructions to newer, open spaces, farmlands, non-agricultural lands that they have access to, which is the agrarian, land-owning castes. Yes, they move, in the places where they have availability of non-agricultural land with them. Its north is now like, it's a huge expansion of the village boundaries, which earlier used to be called Lal Dora. That you live within the residential boundary of the village, but now that has expanded hugely. My village, now has gone into the fields so much. But Dalit households, there's never, you will not be sold the land to a Dalit, the upper caste households don't want Dalit presence, or they don't want to shift to the places where, there is the Dalit prominence. So it's not just a, secular separation of the settlements. It's also the second point is how differently these locations are served. If you look at the Dalit settlement, huge, amount of absence of public infrastructure, drinking water, drainage, or electricity, as basic as electrifying, electrification of these households. So it's not just that, separation, but also very differentially served and maintained. So the second point from the Pallavi is on PM Awas Yojana. I didn't have actually time to show here the component of housing assistance that some of these households have received. But what I have seen over the years while working on this topic, starting from 2005 onwards, which was the first survey in Anantavaram in Andhra Pradesh, the amount there used to be some 25 to 30,000 rupees for house construction. And I have seen houses after houses remaining incomplete. With that, households start construction, can't complete it. I continue to see the same with 1.2 lakh component of housing in current times, where households have left the construction midway. They can't build it, to the completion. So it has, I think, and then, Harevli, Mehatwar, both had problems of corruption and leakages in terms of receiving the actual allocation, that there is, intermediaries who take money in between, they have cuts and all that, being, distributed across the hierarchies. Now, sorry? Yeah, or an incomplete, house. Pakka but incomplete house. The third point is waste disposal. I mean, Professor, your point is well taken, and I'm sorry that I don't have like a statistical answer to it, because in the recent rounds we haven't covered the idea of how the waste is disposed in these villages. But my observation wherever I have been through these village studies is absolute absence of any kind of proper drainage system in the villages. Most of the village waste flows and being released towards the Dalit settlements or left unattended. No, proper intervention or planning in terms of managing the village waste. Given, the time in the coming years, I would really like to study, this, and would like to also understand how different parts of the villages create different kind of waste. Actually, that's it from my side.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with Ranjini's question. So I think we have a rice production problem in India. I think one way to see it is that rice consumption per capita has gone down and will continue to go down for a little longer. And people attribute it to Bennett's law, where people are diversifying their diets. So, I mean, that's genre's view that we have a cereal gap. We are producing way more and more and more, when consumption doesn't need farmers to produce that much. Now we know we are less sure about the reasons. Now if you travel in Punjab, Tamil Nadu, growing rice is a sign of prosperity. So you get water on a good year, You proudly state you grow rice. If you go ask the Punjab farmers to diversify into vegetables, the response is who grows vegetables? In other parts of India, the Mali community, which are not the upper caste, are the vegetable growers. So as an upper caste, you're not going to... So there's a problem there. Now, how much of this excess rice production is caused by procurement? Our research inverts the question and say, let's look at where procurement has happened. Has it caused rice acreage to grow? And the empirical evidence suggests that that may not be the case at an aggregate level. I believe it's a problem in the traditional rice procurement states, Punjab and Haryana in particular. I do not believe it's a problem in Orissa and Chhattisgarh. You go and ask why is not a problem, it's the design of the procurement system. First, if you grow rice in anything but the lowlands, the government of Orissa will not procure rice because the rice lowland is only good for rice, whereas uplands is good for other things. So there's a very clear segregation on the rice that they'll procure should be from lands where only rice can grow. The second thing, they have an indent system, so it's by acreage, which automatically leaves out the large farmers. And then it's also for a particular quality of rice. So there are inbuilt in the design are ways to discourage a lot of people, and you would expect that that discouragement means it puts the brake on limitless expansion of rice. The problem, however, in India is that we have no limit on how much a state can produce. So we had an incentive problem for a long time when the FCI said when decentralized procurement was introduced, many states announced bonuses over the MSPs and procured endless amounts of grain. And Chhattisgarh at one point had so much excess grain that they tried to get Kerala and Tamil Nadu to buy, and they said, no, our consumers don't like the Chhattisgarh rice. So they were struggling to export, and at which point in 2014 actually, the government said we'll only provide subsidies for decentralized procurement to the extent that you're going to distribute. Again, a break on how much you can produce. So now the states have cut back and are more careful about not over procuring. So I think a lot lies in the design, how you design the program. Going back, actually, there's a related point. I think one of the things that's also missing in the pulses oilseed story is the absence of common sense. So what we see in, Kalyani's also studied soybean with me. So if you look at how soybean and pulses have been procured by the government, within 2 months, you'll find tenders for open sale. So you've just held up a minimum support price and procured, and when they're procuring, all the private players are staying away because you've just buoyed the market. So the private players have disengaged, and after a while, you have tenders which are selling the produce back in the open market. So the prices come down again. So the NAFED representative told me it's like a waterlogged field. You're using a bucket from this end of the field and going to the other end of the field and pouring it back. So you don't have a price incentive. And as soon as you have a price incentive, the technology adoption will take care of itself. I don't think we need to start at the technology end and push it. You have remunerative prices. The farmers are going to make demands on the researchers and say, give me a better variety. So I see it a little differently. One point I think Barbara asked, waste, if you may indulge me, I have a story I would like to share. So the waste is, I think we don't have very good studies of waste. And the CIPET, which is the Government of India Institute, when they studied waste across commodities, they found it was much lower across crops, even for fruits and vegetables. And we are left with this apocryphal number of 38% that McKinsey produced in a report. And I had the fortune or misfortune of talking to a person from McKinsey, and I said, can you tell me how you got the 38%? And the person I spoke to was part of that report and said, we just asked around people like you. And I said, if you did ask around, I would expect a range. Why is it precisely 38? He said, it looks good. So that's the extent of our scientific knowledge of what the waste is. In our surveys across the board, we have found very, very little waste. The waste on the fields, there's a lot of gleaning and reciprocal relations where goat herds will park their goat on lands and fertilize the soil, they take back whatever is left on the field. So there are reciprocal rights on the farm for gleaning. In the markets, there is so much of this. What Mekla Krishnamurthy also said, that there are people who are just harvesting whatever is left and selling it to another market, and so on. So I think the waste is overestimated. On institutional complexity, I think that's a big issue. And yeah, sorry, I'll stop there and we can take the conversation.
Thank you, both of you. So I've just started looking at this data set, and two things is that normally we look at the source of calories, source of proteins and fats, basically looking at some 9 food groups. So that has not yet been done, but usually NSSO in its reports does give the shares so that you know where the source of calories or proteins. So what is also important here to understand is that if any of those more fat items are giving those calories, because this calorie from the rice and wheat has come down because of the quantities. The second important thing is also that the earlier main source of proteins were also cereals, rice and wheat. So now that is kind of stagnant or remaining constant, whereas calories are coming down from this particular thing that I'm looking at it. So that is also puzzling, where is the extra protein coming from, which is remaining stagnant in this period. So subgroup analysis has to be clearly taken a look at to understand what is going on there in the context of. Now the free thing, there is a lot of issues there. There are two kind of free things that's coming up. One is the free rice and wheat. There's a lot of free things listed in terms of free laptop, free TV and so on. So there is a lot of mess up in how MPC itself is being calculated this time in terms of the, so they have, NSSO has given an imputed price and all, but we are not very comfortable with that imputed price that they have given. So how are they really calculating the MPC? So when they are reporting the fractile level, per capita caloric intake, it's very interesting. In 22-23, you find that lower quantiles are having higher per capita caloric intake in 22-23 compared to 23-24. But by the time they cross the 60th or 70th fractile class, there is a complete shift over, where 22-23 is lesser. And if you see that 60 to 70% MPC fractile is where the 2700, 2400 is there. So if you want to now start measuring poverty, you're basically going to come back and say at MPC fractile 70% is where you're meeting your 2400. So there's a lot of issues that we need to, understand more carefully. And this time, and there is a third method, I think Himanshu has written it once, is that there are now, NSSO surveys are happening to 3 visits. One is for weekly, reference period. One is for monthly, and one is for annual for certain commodities. And that, I do not know, sampling methodology is also making some other errors or changes from 2011. So there's a lot of more issues there.